Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, Dutch lacers, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm Useful Idiot. Welcome. And let's go to Germany and around the globe. Talk about Deutsche Bank. As long as we're talking about banker scum, and certainly banker scum that are in the news these days, Deutsche Bank is the Mac Daddy, is the kingpin right now of banker scum. And well, they should be. And there's a lot of mystery about what exactly is going on with Deutsche Bank. And the fact that someone like Ms. Shedlock really doesn't know what's going on, just knows there's something peculiar going on, says that there's a lot of people out there that really don't know. And of course, the things we do know is that they are cooking their books, because all banks cook their books. We know that they're incredibly interconnected, one of the most systemically important banks in the Eurozone and in the world, because of all their cross connections. And then also the core capital valuations. Those we don't know about, although we know compared to someone like Lehman, the core capital valuations are not so bad apparently. But anyway, the derivatives book is what most people are concerned about, and they have a huge derivatives book, 41 trillion euros according to one source, and their immediate exposure could be $30 billion or more. But the other reason why Deutsche Bank is in the headlines recently is they've been taking a lot of hits, and there's a lot of us in our circles, of course, that have been talking about weakness at Deutsche Bank and the potential for a lot of drama at Deutsche Bank for some time. In 2015, they cut 35,000 staff. And we've seen their shares drop dramatically. I think they were $120 a share in 2007, I believe, and then they're somewhere around $10 a share right now. So things are not looking so good, and a lot of people think that Deutsche Bank is headed for failure. And I'm not necessarily so sure about that. As we've seen in this bizarro world, this new economy, this new financialized world, things are not really quite so simple. But one of the other big stories that's coming out right now is the fact that the United States is seeking a mortgage-backed settlement with all these banks, of which most of the big banks on Wall Street and Euro banks have all been called out on this, and Barclays, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, among three in Europe. But they still call it mis-selling, quote, mis-selling, unquote. They still don't want to use the word fraud, and that's unfortunate, because that's certainly what it is. And then the other part of the reason why Deutsche Bank is in the headlines associated with this potential settlement is 6 current and former Deutsche Bank managers are also charged with derivatives fraud involving Italian banks. So once again, we see this connection between all these European banks, and certainly banks on Wall Street, and Deutsche Bank doing a derivatives fraud with Italian banks. And then, of course, with the problems with the Italian banks are going to overlap with the problems at Deutsche Bank, and there are problems with Italian banks right now. But also recently, too, Deutsche Bank reduced their loan loss provisions and derivatives accounting methodology changes. And that's one of the things that Ms. Shedlock brought up that sent a red flag up for him, was the fact that the Deutsche Bank is using a different methodology to figure out their derivatives. And like we've mentioned before, that could be a way, certainly, of covering up problems. But we also have seen this fine that the United States is considering levying against Deutsche Bank of $14 billion. And there's rumors, of course, they're going to whittle it down to about $5.4 billion. And that's an interesting coincidence, because apparently Deutsche Bank has set aside $5.5 billion for this very purpose. So that is the number that they are going to try and get. And they probably will, but certainly a $14 billion hit for Deutsche Bank at this point in time would be quite a huge hit. But the other thing that's going on, of course, is it's all a confidence game. So Deutsche Bank's taking a lot of hits. And on September 30th alone, they lost nearly 9% of their value at opening, and the shares that are 33-year low, as I mentioned earlier. And I can now confirm share value was $120 in 2007, is now under $10. And the bank admits there's, quote, a perception problem, unquote. So there continues to be sell-offs. And hedge funds have been pulling out from the bank the same way they've been pulling out from Wells Fargo. I'm sure we're going to see a lot of companies and other banks pull back on their exposure to Deutsche Bank, and undoubtedly that's already been going on. And then CEO John Cryan has denied any new capital needed, or that they will need a bailout. So that's one reason why we know they need new capital and they're going to get a bailout. And Merkel says right now, Germany says that there will not be a bailout, but of course that's nonsense when push comes to shove. And in fact, there's articles already appearing that say that they're already working on potential bailouts for Deutsche Bank. So, in fact, here is a note: Die Zeit magazine reports that they're already working on a plan, and that Germany will bail out if necessary. The government may buy as much as 25% of Deutsche Bank, and then there's also the possibility discussed in one of these articles that Qatar may buy up their shares to 25%. So we have a potential 50% buyers of Deutsche Bank right now, and but it's a huge balance sheet, and that's another reason why we know that there will be a bailout. 58% of German GDP represented by the balance sheet of Deutsche Bank, $2 trillion in assets, and it really doesn't matter that they've been basically indicted for every single banking crime that can be done, and they're still standing and still systemically important: LIBOR rigging, precious metal manipulation, currency manipulation, money laundering, and then of course these mis-selling fraudulent mortgage-backed securities. So anyway, they are on the ropes for sure, but I'm just not buying all the noise out there about the imminent collapse of Deutsche Bank. Although I don't want to rule it out, because these things have a habit of just happening. And we can see all these signs, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee, and particularly because it's very crucial at this point that everybody remains standing in spite of all the promises there be no more bailouts. And Merkel says they won't bail out Deutsche Bank. They just can't really afford to have this sort of ripple, this sort of damage, this sort of carnage in the middle of everything else that's going on. And like we say, cross-party exposure is one of the main ones. And if that wasn't enough, well, Commerzbank, another major bank in Germany, is also having a lot of problems. So once again, here we have Germany, which is an economic powerhouse in the Eurozone, and is at the core of keeping this entire Eurozone thing afloat. And they're having problems with their own banking system, substantial ones. Commerzbank just laid off 9,000 people, a fifth of its entire workforce, and they're going to scrap their 2016 dividend. They're already 16% government owned, and they're still on the ropes. So once again, we're seeing that the entire global banking system has never recovered from the damage unleashed in the 2000 debacle, and all this talk of fortress balance sheets and the rest is a bunch of horseshit, and kicking the can down the road only goes so far. And we're seeing it catch up. And Deutsche Bank right now is certainly teetering. And then you add to that two other recent stories that came out as well. One, of course, is pointing out the fact that people need to remember that Deutsche Bank was at the heart of all the secret bailouts that were given between 2007 and 2011 by the Fed, $354 billion. And once again, that's over double what the Lehman Brothers required at one point. So they got a pretty substantial bailout at that point. That both tells about their weakness at that point in time, and also the fact that they've had a lot of funds flow through the bank courtesy of the Fed and their cheap money ever since. And then the last story that just came out yesterday about Deutsche Bank and this huge barrage of Deutsche Bank stories is that the ECB supposedly gave Deutsche Bank special treatment during the stress test. And I find that a moot point, actually rather amusing, because, of course, all the banks in the U.S. and in Europe are given special treatment by all of these stress tests. They're a joke. And all the evidence we need is seen by all these banks that, once again, are on the ropes and teetering and perhaps collapsing when mere months ago, several months ago, they had passed all these so much ballyhooed stress tests. So there we have it. Lots of banker scum at Deutsche Bank, and if things get worse, it could get very dramatic indeed. But I suspect that they will try and do a bailout, try and do it as relatively quietly as they can, and then move on. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.